for the 4th of July, so I hope you folks are having a good time too. All right, so today though, we're going to be going ahead and telling you a story that really has two different categories here. We're talking about the wild women, the ones who out-hustled, out-danced, and realistically out-survived all the odds. Somebody's having a good time out here. And then, of course, we're talking about those worst men. We're talking about the liars, the cheats, the con artists, those ones who tried and oftentimes successfully shot themselves into both history and into gold rush legend. Now, let me be clear, folks. Alaska back during the gold rush, well, it was not necessarily polite society. Even the lawmen and their frontier justice, well, they tended to grade on a curve sometimes. To paint a picture, it was more like a chaotic carnival, where the riches you were looking for, or the prizes, were riches beyond your wildest dreams. And the rides, they sometimes could be deadly. But before I begin, I do want to premise my presentation here for a moment. If you were with me yesterday when we did every town, every tale, all in 45 minutes, there will be a slight overlap, okay? That's because for the folks that didn't attend yesterday, well, first, shame on you. But second of all, you really do need a foundation of the Alaskan Gold Rush to understand those larger-than-life characters that made it what it is. So I will be providing that to you today. As for the guy giving you this presentation and talking to you about dance hall queens and con artists, well, my name's Jared Cozy, and I am one of your Alaskan Enrichment ambassadors. As for the gentleman over here, well, with all the hair and the devilishly good looks, well, that was me all those years ago when I decided to make Alaska my home. I've been in Alaska for roughly around 10 years now, and spent most of my time traveling extensively throughout the state, swapping stories, both true and tall tale, and even sometimes from a bar stool. You know the kind I'm talking about, folks. And writing books about these stories, about the cities, the sights, and the attractions you folks have traveled so far north to see. Now, that's enough about me. You didn't come here from that. You came here for a presentation on the Gold Rush. Am I right? Yeah. All right. Well, the first thing you need to know here, though, is that my presentation might be slightly different than some of the ones you've seen so far on board. For starters, well, I'm not a naturalist. So if you're looking for information about flora and fauna, well, you might need to stick around for Kathleen's presentation later on. No, today's presentation, though, is going to be somewhat about my background about storytelling. So it's going to bring to life the fables, the folklore, and the myths surrounding one of the most interesting times in American history. And well, where that story really needs to start is the Alaskan Gold Rush itself. So some of you may have heard about or read about it so far on your travels, but what you need to know is, well, Gold Rush fever hit Alaska like a cold snap. It was sudden, it was contagious, and if it was not properly prepared for, well, it could be deadly. Now, you had folks selling their homes, leaving their families, leaving farms, leaving very, very good lives just because they read somewhere on a newspaper that they were pulling up a ton of gold out of a creek that they couldn't even pronounce. Fortunately for them, well, the ton that they were actually talking about, well, that was actually all the supplies you had to carry on your back to survive the Alaskan Gold Rush. Now, come they did, though, between the years of 1880 and 1910, roughly around 100,000 people traveled all the way north to strike it rich. Now, 100,000 might not seem that large in today's standards. After all, 1.7 million people travel to Juneau every single summer now. Fortunately, not us included, but all the other towns, Ketchikan, for instance, gets 1.5 million people every single summer. But back then, what you need to know is, well, this was massive for everybody. We're talking about hundreds of tents popping up along frozen lakes, barrels of supplies moving up and down the coast constantly. In towns like Seattle, well, Seattle transformed into an outfitting factory almost overnight. And in Alaska, well, we're talking about towns tripling in population, businesses booming, and hope soaring about as high as the mountains we're going to see in Sitka tomorrow. Well, during the Gold Rush, though, they were traveling to one of three different places. I'm going to ask the crowd, does anybody have any idea where those places were? Feel free to shout out anything. Ketchikan, unfortunately not Ketchikan. I'll give you a hint. One was the capital city of Alaska. And I'm not talking about Anchorage. Skagway was one, yeah. Juneau. And then the third one was Nome. So, yeah, Nome is a little outlier. I'm going to give you a little explanation about that one in a second. But in the 1880s, folks would have been traveling to that initial gold rush in Juneau, Alaska, where they discovered roughly around $94 million worth of gold between the two mines, the Alaska Juneau mine and, of course, the Treadwell gold mine. A little later, though, in the 1890s, they would have been traveling to actually Dawson City and the Klondike gold rush by way of Skagway. You see, back then there were no roads leading to Dawson City, so folks either took their chances with the Canadian wilderness, which was certainly not the recommended route, or they did something very similar to what we all did. They hopped on a boat, they sailed the Inside Passage from either Seattle or San Francisco, like we did, and when they got to Skagway, they traversed the Coast Mountains into Canada to find their riches. And find riches they did. Well, at the Klondike Gold Rush, they discovered roughly around $175 million worth of gold there, which makes it, of course, the largest of our three gold rushes up here in the north, and the second largest gold rush in North American history. After that started to slow down, though, folks headed even a little further north. Now, again, Nome is a bit of an outlier, so I don't know how much you know about Alaskan geography, so I want to draw everyone's attention to my hand here. Can everyone see that in the cheap seats in the back over there? Yeah? Perfect. So I'm going to flip my hand around now. Just what does everyone see there?
Alaska.
Right, exactly. Now, in Alaska, Juneau's going to be down here in the bendy bit. At the base of my thumb, that's going to be where Skagway is. And Nome? Well, Nome is all the way over here in the knuckle. As we know, Alaska is not exactly a small place. Does anyone know how many Texases fit in Alaska? 3 at low tide, exactly, yeah. 2 on a regular day, though. Anyway, so that distance is quite significant. But for some, well, it was worth it because they found roughly around $68 million worth of gold there. Now, these numbers, similar to the amount of people traveling north, might seem a little insignificant to us today. But the question is, how much was gold worth in the early 1900s? Does anyone have a guess?
Not as much as now.
Not as much as now is correct. Back then, 1 ounce of gold was only $20. So I imagine the majority of everyone in this room can likely afford a nice ounce of gold with what they have in their pocket. But today, well, those numbers are slightly different. I didn't look at the exact number today, but I think it's roughly around $4,500 for an ounce. So if you imagine that and factor that in here, well, now these numbers are all of a sudden in the billions. Of course, that was worth it for everyone to travel all this way north. But what we need to remember is Alaska, well, it was an equal opportunity territory. And it made and unmade lives with the exact same indifference. So for every millionaire, there was at least 1,000 miners who went home either broke or frostbitten. Now, I know my hand is an excellent form of geography, but I figured I would provide you folks with a map so that you could see exactly where these places are in Alaska and really see how far apart they are from one another. And I'm going to draw our attention down here to the bottom, okay? And that's going to be Juneau here in southeast Alaska. And that's going to be your initial gold rush. And when those 2 mines ended up opening and generating all of that gold, well, it drew enough attention to the town that it actually made the politicians want to move the territory capital from Sitka, which is where we're going to be tomorrow, right here on the coastline, over to Juneau. Okay? Little while later, folks, they would be heading a little further north to where Skagway is, right here at the top of the Inside Channel. Now remember though, Skagway was the gateway to the Klondike Gold Rush, not the gold rush town itself. So I'll draw your attention to this big red blotch up here. That's actually where Dawson City is, and that's the Klondike gold fields. So, as we remember, Alaska's not a small place, so this distance is quite significant. So when people got to Skagway, they traversed the Coast Mountains. Now that only gets you to right about here, to a place called Lake Bennett. At Lake Bennett, it's the beginning of 500 miles of waterways, including 2 Class 5 rapids that people had to build a boat and raft down just to get to Dawson City. Now, if we thought that distance was far, let's take a look all the way over here at Nome on the west coast. Now, back then, there were no specific routes that people would take to Nome. Of course, this was one of them, but many people actually didn't know where they were going. So they would traipse across the wilds of Alaska to get to Nome. So it's tough for me to tell you exactly how far everyone would travel, but to put it into perspective, the distance from here, the Klondike Gold Rush, over to Nome, as the crow flies, is roughly 773 miles. 773 miles of some of the most remote and wild parts of Alaska. Now, that didn't stop them, though. Driven by the dreams of striking it rich, they came anyway. The thing is, those weren't the only people that came. In fact, some people came... Oh, sorry about that, folks. Some people came to Alaska for a very different reason. That's right. The bold, the desperate, the occasionally insane, well, they came north to strike it rich. But so too did the schemers, the hustlers, and of course the downright ruthless. Now, these were the kind of people that weren't looking to mine the gold. In fact, they were looking to mine the miners in every single way they could. Scams truly were everywhere back then. In Skagway, there were shell games on the docks, people selling tickets to non-existent steamships, and others sold supplies, that you didn't actually need at prices that would make modern airports blush. In fact, you could pick up a miracle elixir. You could buy it. It's typically just alcohol and food coloring. Didn't necessarily promise a miracle, but generally they'd get frostbite or loneliness. Now, some desperate men even bought fake gold claims. The chunks of land with a few shiny flakes sprinkled around to trick the buyer. By the time they realized it, the seller would be 2 towns down, counting your silver in a saloon. Because the truth was, only a tiny fraction of stampeders actually ever struck it rich. But the saloon keepers, the gamblers, the madams, and the con men, they were the ones who really were cashing in. So, what that means is the Alaskan Gold Rush meant more than just finding gold. In fact, a lot of the time it meant surviving those trying to take it from you. That's right, the stage was truly set for a human drama unlike anything the North had ever seen. You gotta imagine it. Tens of thousands of men and women pouring into these rough little towns that didn't yet have sidewalks or schools or even a proper jail. What they did have was a saloon every 20 feet, a brothel every block, and of course a general store that doubled as the courthouse. The tension truly was built right into it. You had miners chasing fortunes, shopkeepers chasing miners, and con men, chasing just about everybody. A lot of times, the law would be 3 days late and drunk as a skunk by the time they got there. So a lot of the disputes, folks, were handled actually with fists or gunfire. And of course, the occasional chair over your head. Now, these towns, they truly did teeter between boomtown excitement and absolute collapse around every turn. So yes, the stage was set, not for polite society, but for stories. And honestly, that's why we're all still talking about it today. So, here's a fun question. Who did we think had it rougher, the women or the men? Women, okay, we got a few there. Anyone think the men? Okay, so we're a little mixed bag right now, so men or women, okay. Well, the men, they oftentimes froze and starved and, of course, got conned. Some of the women we're going to talk about actually built empires in these towns that didn't yet respect the law. Honestly, if you ask me, I would still probably put my money on the women, but I'll let you folks decide after you've met our cast of characters. Now, of course, we will do so ladies first. But before I jump in, I did want to provide you with a bit of a timeline so you can see where these people actually ended up in our Alaskan Gold Rush story. And at the beginning, we have George Carmack and Frank Canton. Now, these were two of some of the firsts in Alaska, and they were actually both heralded as good guys. But as we'll learn as we get to know them, not everything was so black and white back in those days. Next, we have Mary Thomas, or Black Mary, and we have Jefferson Smith, or Soapy Smith, who are two of our more notorious characters in the Alaskan Gold Rush story. But when we meet them, you'll find out that maybe one was kind of painted with the wrong brush, while the other one truly was rotten to the core. After them, we'll go ahead and move on to Cad Wilson and Wyatt Earp. Now, of course, one of these people doesn't need any introduction, but in fact, their counterpart during the Alaskan Gold Rush may have been more recognizable and in fact more famous up here in Alaska. After that, we'll move on to Ruth Brown and Alexander Mackenzie. Now, these two are, from very different walks of life, but you'll notice they both leave their mark in Alaska in different ways. Next, we have Kathleen Rockwell, or Klondike Kate, who is more commonly known for her famous flame dance up in Dawson City, which would literally set the stage on fire. And then finally, we'll round out our characters with Albert Johnson. Now, very little is actually known about Albert Johnson, but what ensued after the authorities came knocking on his door will forever be remembered in the Yukon. Okay, so now that we have our timeline and we know where everyone falls, are we ready to meet the ladies? Oh, come on, can we get the ladies a little more than that? There we go, okay. All right, and we start our journey off with Mary Thomas, a.k.a. Black Mary. Black Mary wasn't just a businesswoman, she was considered a facilitator. She was a madam in a number of different brothels up and down southeast Alaska, but she's most famous for being the madam of the Star House, owning the Star House in Ketchikan, which was one of the more infamous establishments on Ketchikan Creek. Now, she demanded fear and respect in equal measure, not because she asked for it, but because she demanded it. Of course, running a brothel is one thing, but during Prohibition, well, she added another service. That's right, liquor. The federal government came to Alaska and said, no more booze. Well, Mary took it upon herself to provide that service. Where there was demand, of course, Mary would supply. And how she did so was installing trap doors underneath the Star House. So if you picture this, rowboats coming into the creek at the dead of night, passing up illegal Canadian whiskey through the trapdoors where no one's the wiser. All of a sudden, the Star House is 1/3 brothel, 1/3 gambling house, and 1/3 speakeasy. Isn't it crazy that booze was the one out of those three that they didn't want to happen? Anyway, when you have men and women and gambling and booze, well, there tends to be disputes, am I right? Well, you couldn't exactly report these disputes to the authorities. So as the story goes, these trapdoors weren't always necessarily used for booze. In fact, sometimes they were used to dispose of the riffraff after some of these disputes, if you know what I mean. Okay, following Mary in chronological order, we have Cad Wilson. And she came to Alaska in 1898, and she was an entertainer. Now, for women during the gold rush, there were only just a few professions. Of course, there was the oldest one, and then there were the shopkeepers and the innkeepers, and then they were the entertainers. And the entertainers were the highest paid out of them all. And Cad, well, it said during her time in Skagway and her time in Alaska, she was the highest paid entertainer on the entire Pacific coast. Not talking about just in Alaska, I'm talking about all the way down to San Diego. And what made her the most money was her more suggestive performances. Now, I'm not wearing a dress right now, so folks, you're going to have to use your imagination, okay? So Cad would strut onto stage, she'd shake her hips a little bit, and she'd get everyone's attention. And once that happened, well, she would bend over, she'd grab the bottom of her dress, and she'd roll it up just a little bit, all the way until she revealed her boot-clad ankles. I know, exciting, right? Now, I know it doesn't sound that crazy today, but back then it would drive the miners wild. These miners would start to throw silver dollars and paper bills onto the stage. Well, Cad, being the smart lady that she was, she would give them something to aim at. She would start to catch the silver dollars in her dress. And well, as her dress got heavier and heavier, she would have to reach a little further down, pull up a little more of her dress, and hike it up so she could continue catching those silver dollars. think you could probably guess where I'm going with this.
More money.
At one point, her dress would be so heavy that she would be giving the entire room the full Monty. Now, of course, without the nudity, though. I mean, Cad was, a nice lady. She'd be wearing bloomers or stockings and whatnot, but that never stopped the miners from emptying their pockets. Okay, after Cad, we actually stay in Skagway, and we're going to talk about Rose Arnold and Ruth Brown. Now, on our timeline, I only mentioned Ruth because she's actually the protagonist of this story. But in fact, Rose Arnold was there right beside Ruth during this entire time. And these two were survivors in the truest sense. Both of them worked the saloon and, of course, the brothel circuit, carving out lives in a boom town that really always had the odds stacked against them. Now, the odds I'm referring to here actually are what's called the Skagway sin tax. Now, I don't want to go too far into bureaucracy here, but basically the sin tax was a fee that known ladies of the night had to pay to Skagway in penance for their activities. Now, on paper, it was a legal charge and a fee that they had to pay. But in essence, I'm not going to lie, it was more like a business license. See, these ladies would pay it quarterly, and then, of course, they were allowed to go back to whatever it is that they were doing before. But Rose and Ruth, what makes them famous is they actually became the first two ladies to plead not guilty to the Skagway sin tax. And they fought it. And it almost looked like it was going to work. In fact, they were both acquitted originally. The problem is Ruth was actually the madam. So they started to target her. And she was arrested again, and rearrested again and again and again. And eventually, Ruth actually not only had to pay the sin tax, but in fact, she had to also pay the court fees, which equated to roughly around $5,000. Now, that's a lot of money today, if you can imagine that in the early 1900s. Now, needless to say, after this happened, neither of them were ever seen in Skagway again. And rounding out